Good afternoon, and welcome to our First Friday webinar. This is a series of webinars sponsored by the Women's Resource Center, led by the founder of Women's Money Empowerment, Dr. Laura Mattia. My name's Jean Scheuer. I am a volunteer for the Women's Resource Center, and I'll be your host today. As you will notice, we've muted all lines, but we still want to hear from you. To ask a question, click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the webinar, Laura will answer as many as time allows. I also want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website next week. Before we start, I wanted to take a moment to tell you a bit about the Women's Resource Center. We're a nonprofit organization focused on empowering women in Manatee and Sarasota counties since 1979. We provide mental health counseling, career planning, educational scholarships and programs, and legal and financial consultation and education, all at low cost or no cost to our clients. We serve approximately 2,000 women per year with attendance of over 8,000. Thank you for attending today's session, Financial Transitions, Taking Your Next Step. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Mattia.
Thank you, Jean. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. We've been running these webinars now. This is the third month. We started in May. And the first month, we actually talked a little bit about what are some of those key financial things you should be thinking of as we were moving into this kind of new world this transition that we're going through. Last month, we talked about the 10 steps to claiming your financial power. And today is a little bit of a continuation of that. And we're also going to be talking about taking the next steps, what you really want to be thinking about, what you should try to avoid. So we're slowly progressing along here. I'm loving doing this. I have been working with women in money for over 20 years. My research as a PhD, of course, I do research, is all around women in money and the different types of situations that various women might get into, whether a woman is widowed or she's divorced or lost her job or what have you. And the main thing is that we want to try to encourage all women to get more engaged in their financial situation, to understand the things that are going on. And the more you understand how money works, the greater your sense of control will be, and hopefully you'll have more peace of mind in doing so. Overall, we want to, again, talk today about those 10 steps to claiming your financial future or your financial power. We started talking about this last month and we really didn't completely finish. So I wanted to finish that whole conversation because I think when you start understanding that conversation, you'll start identifying those financial mistakes or those pitfalls that we want you to avoid. And then just talk a little bit about the idea of really taking a comprehensive view of your financial life. And remember that when we're talking about claiming your financial power, we're really talking about not developing or building a whole pile of money. We're talking about finding the best life that you want to live and using money as a tool, as a resource. So that's what our focus has always been and will continue to be. And so when we talked about the 10 steps to claiming your financial power, we talked about, first of all, defining what that best life is. What does it look like? And it's all based upon your values and your goals and what you really need to achieve that. So we went through really talking about items 1 through 7 on here. We didn't get too past the invest responsibly, and that's really where we're going to pick up from here. If you want to know any of those items prior to 1 through 7, I encourage you to watch the other video from last month, June. So we're going to talk about investing responsibly. And I did talk about very, very quickly the idea of knowing your risk tolerance, your risk capacity, how much risk you're willing to take. Creating an investment plan that incorporates that understands and recognizes the risks of investing and brings that into your overall plan. The reason why we want to create a plan is that we don't want to make decisions when we are in an emotional state. We want to have a discipline around our plan. So we want to keep emotions out. Whenever we allow emotions to get in the way of our decisions, it's never good. We then started to talk about the concept of modern portfolio theory. And this is a scientific theory that has been developed over the course of really 70 years now. It was first developed by a gentleman, Harry Markowitz, back in 1952, where he published a journal talking about this concept around modern portfolio theory. Since then, things have been added on, and as we started getting more computer power, they were able to demonstrate and prove his theory empirically and define how it works. So this concept of modern portfolio theory, the science behind investing, becomes very, very important. And so that's really what I want to focus on. I also want to talk about the idea of understanding what you're investing in, which we did talk a little bit about, and understanding fees. But so when we talk about understanding risks, there are a variety of risks that are involved in investing. And depending upon what you're investing in, you're going to focus on some risks versus others. Most people understand the risk of volatility, especially when you're investing in the equity markets, because we know that the equity markets don't go straight up. Over the long run, they do go up, but along the way, they can be very volatile and they can go up, down, sideways, and so forth. And so we see that all the time. And the key is that you don't want to necessarily ride this volatility. You want to somehow mitigate it, because this is an example that shows that if somebody was to lose 50% of their portfolio, and many people did back in 2001 and also in 2007, where they lost 50% of their portfolio, it can take a very long time to dig out of that hole. This example shows that if you just got lost 50% and you were able to get 10% every year, it would take you 20 years to get back to the beginning. And so it's really hard to dig yourself out of that volatility. So one of the things that I did to explain volatility, I was teaching at USF. I created this program for future financial planners, and I really wanted to drive this home for them. And then I also was doing a presentation for another investment group, and I wanted to really bring this home. And so I talked about these two different investors, Fast Francis and Steady Eddie. Fast Francis says, I don't care about volatility. I understand that eventually the market always goes up. And so I'm going to allow myself to just invest in the S&P 500, and I'm going to ride it down, up, sideways, whatever. But over the long run, I'm going to have more money. Steady Eddie says, no, I can't deal with that kind of volatility. It creates problems for me. I can't sleep at night. What if I need that money sooner than I thought I needed it? And so Steady Eddie says, no, I'm not going to bear that kind of risk. What I did for this demonstration was I actually took the returns of the S&P 500. The S&P 500, again, is the top 500 corporations in the United States that are trading on the exchanges. So when they talk about the S&P 500, you know those are the largest corporations in our country. So I took the returns starting from 1980 and I plotted them on this Excel spreadsheet, actually. And if you'll notice that for 2019, my presentation was in the beginning of November. So I did not do the entire year for 2019. Someday I'll update this slide, but it doesn't really matter. It's, I want you to get the gist of all of this. And you can see, first of all, when we say returns always go up, you can see in the first decade in the 80s, they went up just fine. In the second decade during the 90s, they went up as well. But unfortunately, in 2000 to 2009, we did not have positive returns. For that entire decade, we had a problem. And so when people ask me, really, I want to invest, but I need that money in the next 5 years, I'm often going to steer them away from the US stock market because, again, over any 20-year period, we definitely see always positive returns, but there have been 10-year periods where we've seen losses or even a flat return. So it's important to know that. The other thing that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, because I really want you to understand how we measure risk or volatility. Again, when I say risk, I'm specifically talking about volatility, but there are other risks when we, at a later date, start talking about bonds or emerging markets or other kinds of investments. There are other risks associated with them. With equity, what we're looking at is volatility as being our primary problem. And we usually measure it using a statistical term called standard deviation. And for those of you that had a statistics class many, many years ago, I'm sure you have faint remembrance of standard deviation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But one of the things that I just want you to notice on this slide here is that based upon standard deviation in a portfolio, your actual real return is always less than your average return. And it's something to recognize that the standard deviation, the volatility of your portfolio going up and down, will create a volatility drag on your overall return. So when somebody comes to me and they said, well, I had a -6 return. I didn't even have a whole percentage point negative return in 2000 to 2009. That's not true. It actually was almost 3% negative if you took into account that standard deviation, that volatility component of your portfolio. I then, just for sake of this demonstration, created two portfolios. The top portfolio that's not highlighted is Francis's portfolio. And these numbers, starting out in the 1980 of 25.8%, 1981, negative 9.7%. Those are the actual returns of the S&P 500. Remember, Francis said, I'm just going to invest in the S&P 500. I don't care about volatility. I'm going to write it up and write it down. So the top numbers from 1980 through 2019 are the actual returns of the S&P 500. Steady Eddie, however, he used modern portfolio theory, and he created a more diversified portfolio using asset allocation as a way to reduce volatility. And so the numbers beneath that are highlighted in yellow, those are his returns. And one of the things that you might notice with his returns is that they're not as swinging as wildly as Francis's returns. However, both of them had a return, an average return of 9.9%. But I just told you that standard deviation, the volatility matters. So if we include the standard deviation, we can see that Steady Eddie's standard deviation, his volatility was half that of Francis's standard deviation. And that means that he actually had a greater real return than Fast Francis. Now, this is all due to this issue around compounding. We know that compounding on the upside works for us, that as we are getting positive returns, compounding is a good thing. The problem with compounding is on the negative side. When we have negative returns, compounding drags the portfolio down more and we actually have less money. I'm going to give you a little bit quick tutorial on standard deviation. It's not as crazy as somebody might think. Really, when we're talking about standard deviation, we're talking about actual returns. So in this case, both for Fast Francis's and Steady Eddie's portfolios, they had an average 9% return over the course of that 40 years. And that's represented in the red line. And I'm sorry, I should have on the x-axis of both of these graphs, the concept of time. So this is over a period of 40 years where they have an average return of 9%. The thing is that standard deviation measures the actual observations of each year, because we know that even though over those 40 years we had a 9%, sometimes we had a higher return, sometimes we had a less return. So every year the actual return for each year is different than 9%. And so that's what I have plotted here, is I have Fast Francis's actual return numbers for each year. And you can see that she has a much wilder swing, whereas Steady Eddie's actual returns were much tighter to the average return. And that's what's driving that overall standard deviation. And ultimately, what's driving the return. So this concept of standard deviation really matters, because when you're talking to somebody, if you have investments with that you're investing yourself or you're working with somebody, you always want to understand the standard deviation of your portfolio. And financial advisors should be able to tell you that off the top of their head. They should be managing that return. That risk. It's very hard to manage return. Return is going to be what return is going to be. But advisors can manage risk, and they should be managing that standard deviation. Just to bring it a little bit closer to home, for those of you that are mathematically inclined and do remember a little bit about standard deviation, I just wanted you to understand how the standard deviation works. It's based upon the concept that we have a normal distribution, and for the most part, an average return, if we said an average return was 8.7% and the standard deviation was 15.8, that means that 68.5% of the time that you're going to have a return that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 8.7 minus 15.8, which gives us negative 7%, to 8.7 plus 15.8%, which is 24.5%. So we know that 68.5% of the time it's going to fall in that bracket. We know because of the way standard deviation, the concepts behind standard deviation and normal distribution, we know that 95.4% of the time that we're going to get a return somewhere between the neighborhood of negative 23%, which is 2 standard deviations, or 40% of the time. And then for 99.7% of the time, we are going to have a return somewhere between a negative 39% and a positive 56%. And so when people say, oh, what happened in 2008, 2009 was an outlier, really wasn't. It is very possible that if you are invested in the S&P 500, and it has an average return of 8.7 with a standard deviation of 15.8%, it is not unheard of. It is not an outlier to see a negative return that's great, that as great as 38, 40% reduction. And that's something that we want to guard against, especially for anybody that's taking any kind of income distribution out of their portfolio. When we look at, and we actually plotted Fast Francis's return against Steady Eddie's return, you can see that the volatility that Fast Francis experienced, if she took $100,000 and she invested it in 1980, that she would have about $2.8 million over that period of time, over those 40 years. But Steady Eddie, with his less volatile, he didn't take the same dips that she took. And so he wound up with almost $1 million, actually over $1 million more, $3.9 million, because of the reduction in volatility. So it really does matter. It's really important. We highly recommend, this has been empirically documented and shown over and over again. And this is what all the fiduciaries who are managing pension funds, endowments, any kind of charitable type of endowment, those types of things, they take this into account. When they start investing, they understand these statistical metrics that we use to reduce risk out of a portfolio. And that's what modern portfolio theory is all about. It's about not just the concept of diversification. A lot of people understand diversification where I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket. I want to spread them around. And absolutely, that's really, really important. You don't want to be subjected to any individual company's business risk. When we invest all of our investments in a concentrated position, we are now subject to, is that a good management company? Do they have good products? Do they have any kind of legal liabilities? But you're too tied to that individual business. We much rather see you invest in a whole bunch of businesses. So, investing in the S&P 500 means that you're invested in the top 500 companies, which means that you're diversified, and you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Modern portfolio theory takes it the next step, and it says, but the S&P 500 is just one asset class. It's just large cap stocks. And therefore, you want to consider other asset classes. Now, the idea is that if you have one asset class that's going in one direction, and another, which let's say it's investment A, but let's say that's the S&P 500, and you have investment B, which is perhaps a bonds or commodities or some other type of asset class, that you're going to get a smoother return along the way. And so you're not going to necessarily have the high highs of investment A, but you're also not going to experience the lows of investment B. And so you're going to be better off. Now, last webinar that we talked about in June, we discussed what is an asset class. And I talked about the idea that an asset class is a group of investments that all behave in a certain way. They all serve a particular purpose. And I equated it to sunglasses. And I said, okay, fine, we have all different kinds of colors, we have all different kinds of shapes, but in the end, they're just sunglasses. And if you were running a booth at a farmer's market and it rained that day, that you might not sell any of your inventory because it's all in one specific asset class, but that instead what we would want to do is maybe have two different kinds of asset classes, sunglasses and umbrellas. And so that now we have an all-weather strategy, regardless of whether it's sunny or it's raining, you're always going to have inventory that's going to serve your customer. And so I equated that story to the idea of investing, that in the investing climate, we often have climates where different asset classes are more favorable than others. Some times where equities are the best place to be, and other times where perhaps bonds are the best place to be, or international equities are the best place to be. And so we want to make sure that we have different kinds of asset classes. And I guess I should give you some ideas. One asset class would be large cap stock. Another asset class might be small cap stock, which are the smaller companies in the United States. We might have international stock is another type of asset class. We might have fixed income bonds, which are another type of asset class. Real estate in the form of REITs would be another form of an asset class, or commodities. Those are different kinds of asset classes. And so we want to make sure that we have exposure to all those different asset classes. And the way the professionals determine how much of a particular asset class will be in your portfolio is using, again, additional statistical metrics. We use something called correlation coefficients. Some of us also use something called copulas. If anybody's ever interested in learning about that more sophisticated kind of statistical metric, I'm happy to talk about it. But it can get very, very detailed very, very fast. And I don't want to lose anybody, but I do want you to know that there is a mechanism, there is a method of doing analysis around these asset classes to find an optimum level of mixture around asset classes. So hopefully you can either use a portfolio that has been defined by somebody where they've already done that analysis, or if you're working with an advisor, you want to make sure that they've done that analysis for you and they can explain it to you and why each asset class was added to the portfolio. Every time you add an asset class to the portfolio, there should be a role that it's playing. And in theory, it should be dampening that volatility and giving you more opportunity to combat volatility and mitigate it. Here's a little example that I like to show around the power of diversification. Now, I'm talking about the power of diversification from the standpoint of asset class. Remember, or asset allocation. Remember, people use diversification very loosely. But again, there's two levels of the concept of diversification. One is not putting all your eggs in one basket and being very spread out and not taking on individual business risk. And the second is asset allocation. I'm really talking about asset allocation in this example. And so we have two different asset classes, A and B. And if I asked you which asset class would you want to be invested in, probably most of you looking at this must be saying, well, of course I want to invest in asset class A. It has an average annual return that's higher than B. And so why wouldn't I want to do that? But now I'm going to give you the detail of what happened in year 1 and 2. And so here you can see that asset class A is actually more volatile. It was up much higher and down much lower, more volatile than asset class B. And so now you might be saying, gee, she doesn't like the volatility, and that's clearly a problem. So maybe I'm not sure now. So what I did was I took the asset class A and asset class B, and then I took a combination of both 50% asset class A and 50% asset class B to show you what happens. And so if you notice, asset class A and asset class B are what we call negatively correlated. When A is up, B is down. When B is up, A is down. And so that's what you're really looking for when you're adding these asset classes together, is you're looking for different patterns of behavior of these asset classes. And so what I did was I said, okay, suppose you had $100,000 and you were investing it for that 2-year period. At the end of that period, you would have $111,000. Okay, not bad. But that volatility did create a problem for you, where it went up, but then it went down, and you wound up having less money. Because if you invested in B, you actually, at a lower average annual return, have more money, which is fascinating to me. I've always found this math to be absolutely fascinating. And that's because of the volatility. And then, of course, if you invested A and B, that's where you end up with the most money. So the point here is that average return, doesn't give you the full picture of exactly what you're ending up in terms of the increase in money. At the end of the day, the return number doesn't fully explain it. We need to understand the volatility in the portfolio as well in order to understand how much money we have. So something to keep in mind when people just give you that flat return number, that's not good enough. Now, I have another exercise to just talk about diversification. I love this exercise. This was published in 2008 by a gentleman named Roger Gibson. He wrote a book called Asset Allocation, which I highly recommend, by the way. It's a great book. I asked him if I could have his slides from 2008, and he gave them to me. Now, he has since done this same exercise every year since 2008. And he has a website that you can go to. It's called Gibson Capital Management. And you can actually see the same dynamics. The pieces on this page move a little, but they move proportionally the same. In other words, the message remains the same over any given 20-year period. Now, this is more than a 20-year period. This actually is the return of 15 equity portfolios. There's no fixed income here, from 1972 to 2008. And what we have here, because I told you there's two measurements that we want to know. On the left-hand side, on this y-axis, we have the average return. So you can see it goes as high as, it looks like 11.5.6 is the highest shape. And then on the y-axis here, we have the standard deviation associated with each of these equity portfolios. And you can see that there's one really dog portfolio out there in this one box all the way to the right-hand side, where it's got a standard deviation of 26 and a return that's somewhere around 5. And so, of course, just looking at this, we might say, well, who would want that portfolio? Now, let me tell you, these portfolios are represented. There's 4 equity portfolios represented by squares, 6 equity portfolios represented by triangles, 4 equity portfolios represented by diamonds, and 1 equity portfolio represented by a circle. So if I was to ask you, if you could have one of the squares, randomly chosen square, so it's not necessarily, you can't pick which one, but I said, would you prefer one of the squares, or would you prefer one of the diamonds? Most of you, if you're starting to follow me, that you want a higher return and a lower standard deviation, will probably pick the triangles. If I gave you a choice between triangles and diamonds, most of you would probably choose the diamonds. And if I gave you the choice of having one of the diamonds or sure thing of the circle, most of you will understand that you would want the circle, because what we want to do is we want to move up and over to that left top quadrant. That is the place that you're going to have the most money at the end of your investment period, a higher average return and a lower standard deviation. So I like to call this the Pepsi challenge. For those of you that are my age or a little bit older, you probably remember the Pepsi challenge, where you have a blindfold. And so currently you actually have a blindfold on right now. You have no idea what these different shapes represent. And now I'm going to take off the blindfolds. And so what I want you to understand is that the squares are single asset classes. So we have a square that's US stocks. We have a square that's international or non-US stocks. We have another square that's real estate, and we have another square that's commodities. The triangles are the combinations of the different asset classes. So it's 50-50 US stocks and non-US stocks, the combinations, the permutations of those combinations. The diamonds are 3 asset class combinations, and the circle is 25% of each of the 4 asset classes that we have in this portfolio. And so to actually even show you a little bit more easily what's going on here, I just want to show you this one combination of US stocks and non-US stocks. You can see that non-US stocks are definitely much more volatile than US stocks, but they can drive a little bit higher of a return. But by having, over this period from 1972 to 2008, by having a portfolio that had a combination of both asset classes, you were able to actually reduce most of the volatility out of the international stocks and have a higher return than either of them individually. And that's because they have a different pattern of behavior. When US stocks were performing well, international stocks maybe did not do as well, and vice versa. Each of them have their own pattern of behavior. I find this fascinating. I don't know if any of you are following me or enjoy understanding this, but it really it's about the math of finding that combination. When we add real estate, it now even becomes better. Honestly, real estate, if we had known during that period, 72 to 2008, was going to perform so well, you might have even said, well, I'll just be in real estate. I won't even bother being in anything else. But still, by combining these other US stocks and international stocks, you can flush out some of the volatility of the real estate. So maybe that still wouldn't be the right answer. And what's really absolutely crazy is when we add commodities, that dog of an investment all the way over there on the right-hand bottom of your slide here, where you see commodities, low return, very high standard deviation, very, very volatile. When we add that to the portfolio, you can see that the top triangles are the combinations where commodities have been added to the portfolio. Over here, ACD has commodities, BCD has commodities, ABD has commodities, and that circle has commodities. So when somebody asks me, should I have gold in my portfolio? Should I have oil in my portfolio? Absolutely, you should have some commodities in your portfolio. I like a basket of commodities, everything from gold to silver to copper to timber. Commodities, quite honestly, have been very frustrating over the past, I don't know, maybe 6 years or so. Commodities just haven't done well at all. But you want to have some of that in your portfolio, because when stocks and real estate don't do well, they will help keep your portfolio up from taking those big dips and dragging your overall return down. So ultimately, if you put your money in just US stocks over that period of time from the 70s through to 2008, you would have a $1 would turn out to be $28. But if you put it in a diversified portfolio of those 4 asset classes, you would have $51 for that $1 of investment. And it's because, again, of the diversification. So Roger Gibson has continued to do this study again every single year. And although those shapes move back and forth on the spectrum of that return standard deviation profile, you still see that the circle still remains towards the top left-hand quadrant, and the squares still remain on the bottom of the overall slide. So the dynamics continue to remain the same. And we've seen this shown empirically over and over again. So even for my students over when I teach over at USF or at Texas Tech, because I teach students that want to become financial planners, and they'll ask me, should I just put all my money in the US stock, especially if I'm investing in a Roth IRA or a traditional IRA and I'm not going to need that money for a longer period of time. I still try to encourage them to have a little bit more of a diversified portfolio because of this dynamic. Jean, is anybody asking any questions about this? Are there any? I know we said that we would take questions at the end of this overall presentation, but I do want you to know that if you have a question regarding this, I'd be happy to go over it. Oh, Jean, you're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute.
Okay. There's nothing in there now, but if any of the participants want to type in a question, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, of their screen. You can certainly type a question in, and Dr. Mattia would be happy to answer it. And if it's something that pertains to one of the slides that she's working on now, I'll let her know so that she can answer the question. But there's nothing. Oh, wait, there's one just come up. Okay, this diversification excluded bonds. Why?
I don't know why Roger Gibson chose to exclude bonds, honestly. He just wanted to show that all equity types of portfolios are not the same. And so certainly if you include bonds, fixed income, it also will dampen the overall volatility. The thing is that we all know that with bonds, the role of a bond in your portfolio is not to generate necessarily higher return. So it will dampen your overall return to a certain extent as well. We should do a whole session around bonds because bonds have a different kind of purpose in your portfolio. I think that he really wanted to just focus on the idea that that even with equity, that not all equity is the same, and you do want to find different types of equity that have different patterns of behavior. Okay.
Okay.
So again, this is a really, really important finding that was developed over the past 70 years in the world of investing. And anybody that is working as an investment manager, this is the analysis that they're trying to do for you, or should be doing for you, in terms of understanding the volatility. And this is the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. It's all about having a strategy. It really is all about having a strategy. It's about having the discipline around that strategy to have that overall asset allocation. It's really important to understand why you have these different asset classes in your portfolio. And it's really important to remain in that asset allocation. And so that's where we get into the concept of rebalancing and making sure when the overall risk dynamics change because one asset class has gone down, it's time to rebalance. But it's also the idea of keeping emotions out of it. And that's why I tell people, even if you're not working with an advisor, even if you're not working with a partner, or a spouse, or somebody else, that you should have a strategy that dictates for you what you're going to do and when you're going to do it, so that you don't wind up falling into the behavioral traps. And there's a whole area of research and work that's been done around behavioral economics, behavioral finance, that shows that the average investor doesn't do well. There's a firm up in Massachusetts called Dalbar that has done a lot of studies on how the average investor behaves. And they find this information over and over and over again. And here just shows for a 20-year period from 1999 to 2019, we had two recessions. We had SARS, we had the H1N1, we had MERS, we had a lot going on. The average return, or the actual real return, I should say, for US stocks was 6.1%. If you were invested just in sovereign government debt, the average return, real return, was 5%. And inflation has been fairly low. It's been below the 100-year average of 3%. It's been around 2.2%. The average investor, however, did not fare as well. They didn't even do as well as just investing in bonds. And the reason for that is because most investors don't have a strategy. They wind up reacting emotionally to the market and doing the wrong thing. And I'm telling you that even professional finance people, it's interesting how many professionals I work with as clients who say, I know how to invest. I can invest other people's money perhaps, but I can't invest my own because I can't trust my own behavior. I'm yanking it out at the wrong time and I'm doing the wrong thing. This is a great slide. This only shows from 2000 to 2010. What happened during that period? Remember, I showed you that period, if you were invested during that period in the S&P 500, which is this greenish blue line, turquoise line, that you would have lost around 2.7% of your portfolio during that period, which was not bad if you just held onto your chair and didn't do anything. Once you chose that strategy, you're going to invest in the S&P 500, then you have to stick with that strategy. So it's really important, no matter what your strategy is, that you have that discipline. But over that period of time, you see, it went down in 2001, 2002, it went down in 2008. What we have against that, the pattern of returns for the S&P 500 is cash flows into the market and cash flows out of the market. And you can see what happened in 2002. The cash was coming out of the market right when it was at the bottom. This is not buy low, sell high. This is the exact opposite. People were taking their money out in 2002. And it happened again in 2008, 2009. A matter of fact, April of 2009, which was the very, very bottom of the US stock market, was the largest cash flow out of the market. And so it was exactly the wrong. So you can imagine, you put money in the high, you take it out in the low in 2002, then you start putting it back in as it's growing. You put it back in maybe 2007, oh, everything's wonderful. And then you take it out in 2008. That's how people do a lot of damage to their portfolio. So big mistake in doing that. Okay, so I am going to now.
Dr. Laura,
yes.
We have another question. Can I? Mm-hmm. Okay, how much money should you consider to invest if you are starting your investing journey? Is there a minimum below which you should not even consider looking into investing?
So this is, investing is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And if you're just starting to invest and you want to just put a little bit away every single month or once a year, just start doing it. There's no reason why you can't start just picking away at it. And so maybe if you were going to do something like a target date fund, that would diversify it for you. But if you decided, okay, I'm going to buy this month, I'm going to put a little bit in large cap stock, and next month I'm going to put a little bit in international stock, there's ways of doing it. And the minimums at some of these custodial houses are fairly low. So you can do it. Don't sit there and wait and say, I have to have, $10,000 before I can start investing. Just start a little bit at a time. Absolutely. I just wanted to talk a little bit because we said that we were going to talk a little bit about mistakes and some of the pitfalls, and I want to actually talk about those. The first one is that I find a lot of people think that they need to make a decision right now, and especially if you're talking to any kind of financial planner or advisor or somebody that's selling products that everybody wants you to do it now. There is not a rush. If you have not done it up until now and you decide that you are not ready, you take your time. And this especially, I find I really want for people to be careful when they're in an emotional state. And emotional states will, especially if somebody's going through a major financial transition, such as widowhood or such as divorce or losing a job or relocating, you're in an emotional state already. And so I always want to pull people back and say, you know what, that product, that strategy, they're going to be there tomorrow. Let's think it through first. So don't rush. Big mistake when people allow themselves to get pushed and they start rushing. Second thing is, again, for especially those folks that are going through transition, particularly widows and particularly senior citizens, people that are a little bit older, are often seen as prey and will also often be taken advantage of by unscrupulous salespeople. So you want to be very, very careful. They are watching out for you. And if you demonstrate that you really don't understand what they're trying to sell, they can often become very, very pushy. And I'm not telling you not to ask questions and to make sure that they answer them, but be aware that they see that as a potential to pounce, and you need to be careful with that. We talked last time about really understanding what you have and what you don't have, understanding what your future expenses are, understanding what your needs are, really getting real, not trying to fabricate anything. This is so important. And it's often overlooked because people, it can be very tedious to create a spending plan or a budget or to get to the real answers. But this is where you can develop some confidence, because now you really know how much you have available to spend, how much you have available to do the things that you want to do. This for a lot of women, we're all so concerned about our families, our children, other people, that I see this all the time, where a son will go and ask his mother for money because he wants to buy that new car or wants help with a down payment, and the mom really can't afford it. And this happens a lot. And sometimes these children are in pretty good financial situations. Okay, you put them through college, they have a degree, they have, a future, and maybe they just need to wait till they can afford those things, because you can't afford necessarily to start doling out your money. And I always try to get my clients to understand what in fact they can afford to give away. So we need to make sure that we understand what you need now and what you need in the future before you start giving any money away. This actually goes back to the whole conversation that we just had around investing and having an actual plan and having a strategy, creating a plan, whatever it is. If you decide you don't want to listen to me and you want to be invested in just S&P 500, okay, fine. That's your strategy, but now stick to it. Don't go bouncing back and forth in and out of it, because now you're going to create more problems for yourself than ever. So the discipline, having a strategy and the discipline to stay with it, I would say that this is one of the number one values even that a financial professional will bring for you, is this idea of helping you manage your behavior and sticking to the plan. So definitely want to do that. And of course, finally, you just want to remember your ABCs, which is ask questions, ask lots of questions. Just keep asking them until you're satisfied with the answer, and do not take do not allow anybody to bully you or make you feel like you're not smart. For me, I have an MBA in finance. I have a master's in finance. I have CFP. I have a PhD in finance. I've been doing this all my life. So I understand a lot of things around finance, but you have some other skills that you've developed over the course of your life, and it hasn't been in finance. And so nobody can expect you to know the things that a professional would know. You need to just keep asking. Don't let people, I've seen it before where people have intimidated their clients to not ask questions, and don't allow that to happen. If you have an advisor or somebody that will not answer your questions, they either don't know, which is a problem. That's one signal that they don't have the skill set that you need, or they're just not being cooperative. They're not recognizing, they're not giving you the respect that you need. And so just walk away from them. There's no reason why you should put up with that. B is buyer beware. Definitely, again, make sure you read all the contracts that you sign. Anything that you buy, anything that you do, you want to understand what that contractual agreement is, and you want to understand what your exit plan is. For me, it's always about the exit plan. If I decide that I don't like this and I don't want to go any further, are there any penalties? How do I get out of it? So that's really, really important. And then the C is, take care of yourself. Nobody else is necessarily going to do that. Now, if you have somebody that's working for you that is actually a fiduciary, hopefully, and they've signed an oath saying that they'll be a fiduciary, hopefully they are caring for you. But at the end of the day, it is your responsibility to take care of yourself. So you must do that. This slide just, I wanted you to get a sense of really what good wealth management financial planning is all about. A lot of people don't understand what it is. And I think that there's even a lot of advisors that shortcut financial planning, wealth management. This is a schematic that I had created actually to talk at my firm, but it's important for you to know. It really starts over in this triangle where it's about identifying your goals, identifying what your best life is, and understanding your family and your overall situation, and synthesizing that information to create a plan and get that plan. Now, once you get that plan, that doesn't mean that it's over. You then have to implement all those recommendations. And so, making sure that you go through the process of implementing those recommendations are important, which includes a portfolio management structure, if in fact you are doing some investing. But, a lot of times what we see is this portfolio management in a vacuum, which doesn't account for any of these other aspects of your life and often can create problems. So you want to make sure that you're doing the portfolio management in the context of everything else, and that there's an ongoing evaluation process to make sure that you're on plan. So you don't want this. Ideally, you probably don't want this either, because this doesn't include the implementation. What you want is a full, comprehensive, holistic financial plan. And to the extent that you do this yourself or you work with somebody else, you want to understand all the different pieces. So again, this is all about using money as a resource so that you can live the life that you want to live. Are there any other questions, Jean?
No, it was really good, informative presentation. I do want to let everyone know that to schedule an appointment with a money empowerment counselor, visit www.mywrc.org or call 941-256-9721. And there are appointments available on Wednesdays from 3 to 5 p.m. I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Mattia. If anyone has another question, you've answered the two already that were up there. So I think that, yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So thank you, Jean. If I could just mention that if any of you are interested in talking to one of the money counselors. I'm one of them. But I've actually brought on a couple of others that are going to be working with us. We have a very strict, we had a whole training session, half a day training session on how to empower our women's money empowerment clients and how to work with you so that we can help you make some decisions and choices. You will never hear any of these coaches say to you, oh, by the way, I want to sell you this, or you come to my firm. They're not allowed to. This is not a bait and switch. You're not going to be, nobody's going to try to sell you on anything. They're just going to try to give you some perspective, hopefully some pros and cons of your various options so that you can make an informed decision. So definitely recommend if you have the time and would like to speak to one of us. I'm sure you'll find it worthwhile.
Thank you so much. Anything else?
No, thank you for hosting this, and have a happy 4th of July. Enjoy your weekend. Try to stay safe.
Thank you. And again, this will be on the WRC website next week. Thank you so much.